Thank you, Isabel. I would like, first of all, to thank you for this conference and for allowing a dialogue between so different specialists. So, I'm a member of the ERC project Everyday Writing. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. I'm a member of the ERC project Everyday Writing Greek, Roman, and Late Antique Egypt, a sociosemiotic study of communicative variation, led by Professor Klaus Bentheim at Ghent University. The project's driving hypothesis is that communicative variation enables the expression of social meaning, and its main aim is to analyze the nature of this communicative variation. Elements such as handwriting, linguistic register, and writing material transmit indirect social messages concerning hierarchy, status, and power relations, and can therefore be considered semiotic resources. We're a team of 6 people. Each one focuses on a different aspect you can see on the screen, and I'm the one working on the paleographical aspect and how to disclose its socio-semiotic potential. To do so, we need to start considering paleography as a means of communication in its own right. For a long time, papyrology and sociolinguistics share the same conservative approach towards the visual aspect of a document, moving into the background and preferring to focus on the text. However, in the last years, things are slowly changing. While the relationship of typography to linguistics has been investigated by Sue Walker and a semiotic approach to modern typography has been theorized by Peter van Leuven, Jean-Luc Fournet introduced the theory of paleographie signifiante in papyrology, stating that paleography can be meaningful. The meaning can concern the content, the socio-cultural context of the writer, and the provenance of the document. Nevertheless, this approach is still quite novel in our field and has rarely been employed. In order to examine the modalities of a script and the semiotic message it conveys, I have been working on the identification and classification of some paleographical features. Since these categories are also intended to be used for our database of annotated documentary text, they need to be clear and unambiguous. I quickly encountered some problems, of course, and I would like to discuss them here. My paper will be divided in 2 sections. The first one concerns some methodological questions, and the second is a first attempt to identify and classify paleographical features, as well as to reveal their semiotic meaning. So for a long time, paleography has been considered no more than an auxiliary discipline to papyrology, a practical tool mainly used to date documents. And especially in documentary papyrology, the external features of a manuscript have usually been neglected in favor of the analysis of the text. As a consequence, first papyrological editions rarely contain information about the handwriting, neither report handshift. You can see in this papyro, this is the end of a leasing of a workshop. Maybe it's not very clear, but yeah. You can see there are different hands, but in the first edition, a brilliant edition by Maspero, there's no signalation of handshifts. And even if in the last years there is a growing attention to the visual and material aspects of text, and this conference proves it, paleography still needs to stand out as an independent discipline. In the last International Congress of Papyrology, only 15 presentations out of 264 were related to paleographical subjects. We can ask ourselves why paleography does not interest many papyrologists. I assume it is not only for the reason I already pointed out, but also for its famous reputation to be a subjective discipline. It is worth to recall the statement of Wilhelm Schubart, even it is dated of almost 100 years ago. You have it on the screen. My German pronunciation is very bad. Paleography is an art or an ability, but definitely not a science. And even for Medea Norsa, one of the first papyrologists who showed a big interest in paleography, the ability to date a literary papyrus was linked to the impression and the judgment of the editor. And as every human judgment, as she would state, judgments on paleography can also be susceptible to mistakes. Approximately 60 years after Schubart's declaration, Turner attempted to take into account objective categories for the classification of his Greek manuscripts of the ancient world. But it is surprising how close he recalls both Schubart and Nordna's declaration by underlining how paleography is neither a science nor an art, but works through a continual interaction of the methods appropriate to both approaches. And in the last resort, a judgment has to be made, and judgment is fallible. Even when there is a genuine effort to objectivity, paleography is destined to rely on natural inclination and subjectivity, and to be characterized by constant ineffability. After Turner, the situation did not evolve any further. It happened to me, and I'm sure it happened to you as well, to attend to some paleographical presentations, and somebody is defending his identification of a hand by saying, well, you know, you feel it. Well, maybe you can make some steps further. So in order to disclose paleography, we need to overstep the classical conception of subjectivity. Intuition and perspicacity are necessary qualities, of course, as in any other scientific field, but they should not be the most crucial ones. In the introduction of studies on Greek and Coptic majuscule scripts and books, Pasquale Orsini makes an important statement. Paleographical skills in judgment must be founded on a knowledge of the history of the writing, must adhere to precise, describable, and repeatable methodological procedures, and must be based on reliable evidence. To start conceiving paleography as a precise and exact science, we need proper terminology and methodology, as every science has. The main problem with paleography applied to Greek papyri is that we do not have a specific nor a common terminology. The linguistic inadequacy of paleography to describe papyrological scripts and handwriting is primarily historical. Paleography began with the treatise Paleographia Greca, Sive de Ortu et Progressu Literarum by Bernard de Montfaucon in 1708, at a time where papyri were not even known yet. The discovery of Clamon papyri are in fact dated of 1752, while the first documentary papyrus, the well-known Carta Borgiana, was edited in 1788. And structural excavation in Egypt started around the second half of the 19th century. At the beginning of the discipline, paleography was therefore mainly dealing with writings on vellum and paper. And for the first monograph on paleography of papyri, we have to wait until 1899, with Kenyon's The Paleography of Greek Papyri. This unfortunate beginning led to a singular situation where different countries personally developed a specific terminology for the discipline, in particular for literary handwritings, so much that a word sometimes has an ambiguous meaning, depending on the national paleographical school we are referring to. I'm thinking about ductus, which has a different meaning in the Italian tradition and a different one in English and in French. While conceiving Greek bookhands of the early Byzantine period, Cavallo and Mahler were surprised to see how little research was being published in English, and had to paraphrase, translate, or invent approximation of stylistic terms already existing in German, Italian, and French. Their contribution, however, did not solve the problem. Editions still contain creative paleographical description. As you can see for this papyrus, UT stated that it is a hand which breathes, which is surely very evoking, but not objective. And still today, a specialized paleographical book has to contain a bilingual glossary of quite basic concepts at the end of it in order to avoid misunderstandings. This is the case for the latest book of Orsini. However, paleography of literary manuscript benefited of a more thorough attention than paleography of documentary texts, where there is a serious lack of uniformity. In addition to this, two approaches are generally employed in paleographical handbooks. One focuses on the letter form and tends to a labyrinthine description of minimal graphic characteristics, and the other one on the evolution of handwriting and its trends. These opposite tendencies share the same risk, that is to lose the focus on the text script, which actually is the object of the study, the first one by examining the slightest details, the other one by dispersing the characteristics of the text into a broad stylistic trend. Relating handwritings to styles might be leading to thinking of style as entities on their own and to overlooking the characteristics of the scripts. While this former approach is proper of most of the handbooks of paleography, the first one was adopted by Bataille in Pour une terminologie en paleographie grecque. The huge effort of the French professor to find an appropriate name to every line, segment, and development of a letter was unlikely vain, since its terminology has never been used by papyrologists. In the introduction of his book, Bataille affirms that after presenting a preliminary study of his work at the International Congress of Papyrologists in Paris, eminent colleagues moved some critics about l'excessive complication des dénombrements and about the fact that his very specific terminology did not have an international breadth. He was therefore pushed to make a French-Latin glossary, a 7-page French-Latin glossary, which appeared at the end of his work. There is a sample on the screen, but did not have a lot of success later on. To sum up, paleography of documentary papyrology lacks of scientific recognition and of a standard terminology. When there is one, it is too specific to a certain academic tradition and language in order to be used by an international milieu. An objective and complementary approach is therefore needed and will allow us to catch the general features of the handwritings of a text. We need to consider the general character of the writing of a document and to start conceiving the handwriting as a dynamic system, even inside the very same texts. So what categories and features shall we then consider? Since I'm interested in disclosing the interpersonal meaning of paleography in documentary papyri, I first turned to the semiotic grammar developed by Van Leuven for modern typography to analyze the criteria he identified. Some of them are obviously not pertinent to ancient documents, as wit. We do not find bold characters in papyri, but there are other ways to express the substantial meaning of a word or a group of words in opposition to the rest of the text. For example, the uses of vacat, different size of letters, and the use of punctuation marks. Other category, nevertheless, can easily be applied to manuscripts as well, as expansion, slope, curvature, or connectivity, even if the semiotic meaning disclosed by Van Leuven has to be completely reconsidered while applying these categories to ancient documents. For the linguist, internally disconnected letters, forms, can convey a sense of not being buttoned up, which can be valued in a negative way, unfinished or sloppy, or in a positive way, easygoing. In Greek documentary papyri, we are inclined to consider a more ligature hand as an evidence for an educated scribe, and a completely disconnected hand as an evidence for the hand of a slow writer. But a professional scribe could be able to use different styles, and he could choose to employ a particular handwriting for some documents in order to privilege legibility and as a sign of respect to the addressee. This is the case with Dioscorus of Aphrodito, who sometimes prefers to use a sloping majuscule, as in this letter, instead of his more common minuscule. In the same way, if the vertical orientation may suggest lightness, upward aspiration, or even instability in printed texts, in ancient documents, it could be more easily associated to a formal and official style as the chancery style, and therefore used by notaries and professional scribes to honor the recipient of the text, as in addresses in late antique letters. I will therefore only use the denomination by Van Leuven when it can be applied to ancient documents, and I will leave behind the semiotic modern values he identified. As for a classification of features in Greek handwritings, Turner uses the following considerations to classify literary hands: the degree of formality, the speed of execution, the skill of execution, the size of writing, inclination of writing, typology of letters as well, and the distance between the lines. Some of these criteria better suit literary hands than documentary hands, as the shape of a rounded handwriting or the speed of execution, which can sometimes be tricky to determine, but the rest of them can be applied to documentary hands as well. And thus, under different names, some of the categories identified by Turner and Van Leuven coincide, others are closer, and some do not appear at all, as wit, which makes completely sense, of course, since Turner was working on ancient manuscript and Van Leuven on typography. I ended up tracing a list with the following criteria: expansion, slope, curvature, connectivity, regularity, degree of formality and distance between the lines. The only category left is the skill of execution, which I consider from Turner, which I consider a characteristics of the scribe more than a feature of the general handwriting. Each category is subdivided as follows, and in the database, I also use the fields unknown, uncertain, and irrelevant, depending on the conservation of the text and on the passage examined. The features speak for themselves, I think, and as for the degree of formality, I follow the definition given by Crisci and Denny, according to which formal scripts pay attention to regularity and homogeneity of letters, show a high level of legibility, and try to adhere to a certain model or to enhance the overall visual aspect of the document. Informal scripts are instead characterized by structural variability, irregularity, and imbalance in the shape of the letters. That does not necessarily imply that only a low-educated person will be able to write in an informal way. A cultured scribe could in fact use a wide range of scripts and adapt them to the nature of the document, as we shortly saw before with Dioscorus Aphrodito. A large corpus of papyri annotating under a paleographical aspect could eventually enlighten us about the profile and the written modalities of the scribe. Since I would like to investigate the relationship between the features and the written expertise of a scribe, I also included in my criteria the typology of hands. For a corpus of women's letters, Bagnell and Crebiore distinguish between professional, secretarial, and personal hands. However, this categorization does not suit all text types, does not represent the whole range of writers, and inevitably occurs in overlaps, since professional and secretarial hands can be hard to separate. On his side, Alan Murgrich offered another tripartite categorization for Greek handwriting from the 4 BC to the 4 AD. It is composed of professional scribes who could write calligraphically, but also in informal hands, professional scribes who could write less formally for certain purposes as literary pieces, and writers who had some education and who could write tolerably well. So they are capable of writing and subscribing documents. But besides this temporal limitation, Murgrich categorization has a preference for book hands. So since both suggestions are therefore not entirely satisfying for my purpose, I would like to propose to adopt Petrucci's classification. It was originally not conceived on papyrological problematics, neither on specific typology of ancient documents, but it has a universality that makes it suitable to different situations. Petrucci identifies 6 categories of literatures, which cover the whole range of what the Italian notable paleographer calls diseguaglianza grafica, graphic disparity. The categories go from colti, the cultural writers, so the individuals who master all the graphic typology commonly used at their time by the society. They usually can express themselves in different languages and they receive the highest education, like, for example, Dioscorus of Aphrodito, until the complete illiterates, analphabeti. Of course, this category does not appear on our database because, for obvious reasons. So, after all this theory, let's go to some practical issues. This is the screenshot of the typographical section of the every database. You can see there's the picture and the text on the left. So when we want to do some annotations, we seize the text that we want to annotate, and we create an annotation with a little plus or the arrow, and then this is what we can annotate following the features that have been discussed until now. And I also added some more, let's say, micro features like punctuation, if there are any, if the scribe uses punctuation or accentuation, if there is word splitting, and hopefully, by combining an analysis of the features and the writer's typology and all the micros annotations and the metadata of a text, of course, which is in another section of the database, we should eventually be able to draw a portrait of the writers, their skills and their habits, as to better understand their societal and the social and historical milieu. So it's like, again, a profiling the scribes, but for Greek documentary papyri. And hopefully this approach will give paleography a novel, more dynamic position in our discipline, leaving behind its traditional use to show an evolution of handwriting or to date papyri. Thanks.